Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When Mayor Michael Bloomberg in 2007 stood before environmentalists and city officials gathered under the giant blue wheel in the giant blue whale in the Museum of Natural History, he proposed a radical idea from London to transform New York's stifling downtown traffic, lower pollution levels those vehicles generate, and at the same time generate tax revenue for the struggling MTA's mass transit systems. Congestion pricing would charge cars $8 to enter Manhattan below 86th Street, later lowered to 60th Street, while trucks would pay a one-time daily fee of $21 no matter how many times they entered the zone. The only exemptions went to taxis. 15 years later, we appear to be on the cusp of finally seeing a congestion pricing plan, quite different from Bloomberg's proposal, though just as controversial. Working off state legislative approval of the plan and concept, if not the details, a traffic mobility committee is assessing hundreds of hours of testimony on how much the fee should be and who should get exemptions. And since the whole reason for congestion pricing is to raise $1 billion a year towards the subway system's $51 billion capital plan, every exemption means the congestion fee will have to go up in order to raise the mandated amount. The original $8 fee on cars could go as high as $23 in some scenarios. As Harry Siegel wrote in the Daily News, much of the debate seems centered on a revenue number in search of a policy. Should taxis and the exploding Uber and Lyft-driven for-hire sectors get exemptions? London is talking about tweaking their plan since they exempted for-hire vehicles, with the result that the number of those cars traversing center city streets have grown so exponentially that buses crawl at speeds no faster than when the plan first went into effect in 2003. Should residents who live in the zone get exemptions? What about outer borough residents traveling to medical appointments? New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy and some allies have gotten into the act, implicitly threatening to blow up the Port Authority and maybe the MTA if Jersey commuters don't get some kind of credit or offset for driving into the zone, though he does not seem to be proposing similar offsets for New Yorkers who pay bridge tolls and then road tolls on the Turnpike and the Garden State Parkway. Perhaps the most serious last-second objection emerged from an environmental impact statement and is centered on arguments around environmental racism. Many through trucks seeking to avoid the fee will likely redirect to the Cross Bronx Expressway, an exhaust-choked parking lot that ever since Robert Moses imposed it on a poor neighborhood has created an asthma alley for surrounding residents. As always, the devil is in the details. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers engaged in the debate over congestion pricing and more generally how we move about the city. Jackie Cohen is the Director of Climate and Equity at the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. Lisa Daglian is the Executive Director of the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA, an in-house riders representative organization. Nicole Gelinas is a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute who's written extensively on transit issues, including the congestion pricing experience in London. And Jose Martinez is the transportation reporter at thecity.nyc, which if you don't read it regularly, you should, who will tell us what it all means. Nicole, you've been following this for a long time. How did we get here? We've been through more permutations than you can shake a stick at. Take us briefly to how we got here.
Right, and thank you, Bob, for having me back as always. Congestion pricing as a concept actually goes back more than 50 years. Back then, the idea was to put tolls on the East River bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge, and that basically got you to most of the goal that congestion pricing is supposed to get you to, which is to stop people from bridge shopping. In other words, if you go through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, you go through the Queens Midtown Tunnel, you come from New Jersey, you have to pay the toll. It's just unique on the east side that you have these toll-free bridges. Just toll shopping in itself creates a lot of congestion and just kind of historical accident, very long story, but why, because of this historical accident, do you get to come into Manhattan from one side for free and the other side not so free? So this goes back to the Lindsay administration. Back then was proposed as a way to both ease congestion and raise money for transit. It has never gotten as far as it's gotten now. And why could Why could this happen now, perhaps, and not happen during the Bloomberg era? It actually points out one of the problems with this plan, the age-old tension between New York State government and New York City government. When Bloomberg wanted to do it, he was the mayor, obviously. He wanted the city to control the program. The city would have controlled the price. The city would have controlled where the money went in terms of transit projects, and the city would have put some of that money away to pay for road improvements themselves. So if you pay the fee, you're driving, you actually get something direct in return, a better quality road. The state legislature said, no, we don't want to do this. Many, many reasons, which we don't have to go through all of that.
They named Shelley Silver had something to do with it.
Well,
Right.
that was, I think that ended up being a little bit unfair, that his members, the project didn't have the votes. Members from Queens, members from the Bronx, people had many, many questions, and the mayor wanted to rush it through with the artificial deadline of this federal money running out. So how did we get it this time around? Because in 2019, Governor Cuomo was a very powerful governor at the height of his powers. The transit advocacy community successfully pinned the deteriorating subway situation on Cuomo. Cuomo needed to do something progressive because he was worried about the left at the time. Congestion pricing seemed progressive. And when he enacted it in 2019, the law said it wouldn't go into effect for at least 2 years. So he gave himself a lot of political cushion for when it finally went into effect. People would blame somebody else. All that obviously didn't work out as planned, so here we are.
Including Cuomo.
Yeah. Right, so here we are in a very different trans-pandemic environment. I won't call it post-pandemic, even though the president does. And considering a very different congestion pricing that would be entirely governed by the state and not the city, which is a big shortcoming of any congestion pricing plan.
Which is one of the points that Mayor Adams made recently when he spoke at Cranes, complained very much about the lack of home rule for the city, of which this is an example. Jackie, Tri-State Transportation Campaign has been a big supporter of congestion pricing generally, even though you see some of the, to me, they're kind of unexpected issues. I didn't see them coming around the environmental racism questions, and Renee Reynolds, who runs the campaign, wrote about those recently in the Daily News, saying that there are ways around them. Where's the argument now?
Yeah, so Renee Reynolds, the executive director of Tri-State, has a really deep history in working on environmental justice issues. She came to Tri-State from the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. So this is something, and I first met Renee when we were both advocates pushing for the adoption of congestion pricing in 2018, 2019. There are some very serious concerns around environmental racism, particularly in the Cross Bronx and the potential of truck traffic being diverted through the Bronx. But ultimately, the Cross Bronx is a disaster already, right? Congestion pricing doesn't make the Cross Bronx Expressway a problem when there wasn't one already. These are problems that the governor really needs to address. Renee has called for, and Tri-State, our colleagues have called for a number of mitigation strategies, like electrifying truck fleets in the Bronx, capping the Cross Bronx Expressway. Congestion pricing was never meant to be a silver bullet to solve all of our congestion and emissions and pollution problems, right? There needs to be some real effort put in by the governor, not just to mitigate the potential impacts of congestion pricing, but to also improve transit ahead of the implementation of congestion pricing so that there's enough buses and subway trips available to folks who are coming back onto transit and out of their cars.
Lisa, the idea, Jackie's not the only one who's talking about all these mitigation things about electric trucks, capping the Cross Bronx Expressway. It's not going to happen, within the next couple of weeks. You've looked very closely at this. You've been in touch with people at the MTA. You've been in touch with riders, the people you deal with. What happens if we don't implement a congestion pricing?
So congestion pricing is the law, as has been passed out, as has been pointed out, right? It was passed into legislation in 2019. And through a series of delays and machinations, here we are in 2022 trying to get to implementation. We'll see what the FHWA, Federal Highways, does with all the information, all the inputs that have been received through 2 sets of public hearings, through thousands of hours of testimony that I and many of my colleagues have listened to, and through hundreds of arguments that, this hasn't been studied. Well, it's been studied for decades now at this point. And the environmental assessment goes really deeply into looking at whether congestion pricing will hit 3 main points, which is, does it reduce congestion, improve air quality, and raise the $1 billion a year for the MTA as is written into the legislation? Our contention is that yes, those are the 3 things that the environmental assessment does in fact show, and therefore it should move forward. The funding that will be raised is so important for the MTA's capital program and the region's riders and the region's economy that it can't be understated, it can't be overstated. We are going to look at the summer of hell as a walk in the park if this funding doesn't come through. We're looking at the loss of funding for signalization projects, for new tracks. Not all of these are shiny, pretty projects like new train cars, which we're also not going to get, but they're the nuts and bolts and the things that hold the system together so that we can get where we're going when we need to get there. Also funding not just for subways and buses, but for commuter rails. And there's money, there's a formula baked in so that the Long Island Railroad and Metro North will each get funding, a portion of the money that comes in. So we'll also see buses within the zone, once congestion pricing gets implemented, moving on a much better rate. Jackie's former organization has pointed out that buses move slower than chickens in some cases. And, that's not really a good way that New York should be known.
We have the slowest buses in America.
Yeah, slowest buses in America.
We could have the fastest chickens.
We could.
Jose,
right. Just one more
Yes.
thing, and we'll also see that emergency vehicles can get where they're going. The mayor's report showing that emergency response is slowing down. So we need to really address all of the things that are going to get people where they're going faster, get people where they're going more reliably, and get us where we need to go, not just now, but into the future.
the last second environmental racism arguments, there have been some constants, especially among lawmakers from outer boroughs. As a Brooklyn guy, I apologize for using the term outer boroughs, by the way, saying, why should my people have to pay? You have Staten Islanders saying, who already have to pay to go from one borough to another, and in the original Bloomberg plan had an offset. They had an offset on the fee because of the tolls they had to pay to come in, to come off the island. The politics of this is extremely complicated, and you've been following it. Besides all the technical questions, I don't think this last second hoopla is really a surprise, knowing how we get things done in this city.
This is one that back in the earlier iteration of this, in the Bloomberg years, you could feel some of the opposition from folks in the boroughs.
Yes.
It's going to happen again. It has been happening where you have some politicians from Queens. Now you have some very vocally from the state of New Jersey saying down with congestion pricing, and I was
threatening some of the federal funding for the MTA. I think it was one of the congressmen was even threatening.
Right. Yeah. That we'll yank support,
Right.
and this has, as Lisa said, a very significant meaning for the MTA, for the millions of people who depend on the transit system, from the commuter railroads to the subways and buses here in the 5 boroughs. There needs to be the steady stream of funding for these big ticket projects, and I know some of the advocacy groups have pointed out that it's no sure thing, and that the funding has come in at a slower pace now for the current capital plan than for previous capital plans where we were at this time. So for the MTA, it's really, really important to have this money come through to get those important projects funded, the new train cars, the signals along, I believe it's 6 stretches of different subway lines, or of 6 subway lines rather, of station improvements, of accessibility improvements, of new elevators in stations to push for accessibility for people with disabilities. So this is all key, but the longer it takes and the more that you have exemptions, that cuts into the purpose, one huge purpose, as we said earlier.
It also
is to
cuts into the
raise
public
revenue.
support. It also potentially
does.
cuts into public support.
It certainly does. So this is, getting it across the goal line. It's been a struggle for generations in this city. We'll see if it happens here, but it's, as you pointed out earlier, it's closer than it ever has been, but still not a layup by any means.
What have we learned from, London, Stockholm, there's another city in Sweden, I think, and then and Singapore has it. There are different models as to, how often do you have to pay every time you go in, or is it a daily fee? There's smaller areas. London is now talking about applying the fee in a much broader area. Have we learned anything from these other cities?
Well, I think we have, and I think that's what points up some of the shortcomings of this particular plan. Now, we can support congestion pricing in theory, which I do, but I think this plan needs serious changes to it. And one of the issues that needs to be looked at and hopefully changed is that there would be no time that you could drive into core Manhattan below 60th Street and not pay a fee. So if you have to drive in 2 a.m. for whatever bizarre reason, people do coming home from parties and so forth, you have to pay a fee, which that in itself shows that they, as Harry said, they are looking at the revenue first and how to reduce congestion second. There's no congestion at 2 a.m. and there's very, very limited commuter rail service. There's no commuter rail service from the
Some
north.
of the other
and-
cities, other cities have a cutoff time.
Right,
That after
this
6
is-
o'clock,
yeah.
after 8 o'clock, the
in
fee does
London,
not apply.
so here you would have to pay a fee all time, whatever, and there's a 14-hour peak hour. 14-hour peak sort of makes the word peak absurd. This is not a peak hour. You have two peak rush hours, and you have times during the day when traffic accumulates that need to be mitigated. Charging the same peak hour for 14 hours straight is not a congestion charge, that's just a charge. So in London, yes, you can drive in overnight if you want, or drive out overnight if you want. And they've actually curtailed the evening hours since they're trying to open up their economy during the third pandemic year, because they thought that congestion charge was hurting the nightlife. And so here we are starting out with 24-hour coverage and no consideration of, do we want to tweak this for some of the issues that London has looked at, including the nightlife. So I think that that's something that needs to be revisited. 14 hours is not a peak, and that just it shows that this is revenue first and congestion second.
Bob, can I
Yes,
say
please.
something? That's great points. And I think that some of the things that we've learned internationally should be advice well learned, advice well taken. So the 7 scenarios that the
Seven
MTA,
scenarios,
seven
right.
scenarios that the MTA has put forth.
Well, that was in the environmental impact.
the environmental assessment, not
environmental
an-
assessment,
right.
sorry.
They were put forth, some of them were done with the original modeling, some of them were added based on public input from the first set of public comments. I think that what we're going to see that comes out of all of the public comments, and that once the Traffic Mobility Review Board, sits down and puts their hats together, and those meetings will be public. We've had that commitment from Jano, and I don't know about anybody here, but I'm so glad not to be sitting on that board. I think we're going to see a camel. I think we're going to see one from, scenario A, something from G. The 3 tenets have to be met, that it raises $1 billion, that it improves air quality, and that it reduces congestion. And it doesn't necessarily need to ascribe to a time or lack of variable charging, so that the MTA and its partner agencies,
I'm sorry, say that again about variable pricing.
they can go to variable pricing.
Yes.
They can go to time.
Because it's all done through,
Right.
it's all done through
Right.
your Easy Pass. It's all done
Exactly.
electronically now.
Yep. So the MTA and its partners that do include the City of New York. So the mayor, City DOT works very closely with the MTA and State DOT on this application. We'll be able to go back and do some remodeling and remixing to figure out what additional scenarios might come out based on what they've heard, based on what if they say, well, I want to give, let's look at a scenario where motorcycles can come in for free on Tuesdays, and you can have minivans come in on Wednesdays for matinee day at lunchtime. And I think that everybody gets a pass at 3:30 on Thursday, something like that. Whatever. Don't hold me to that.
Yeah.
But they can decide what collectively, based on input they've gotten, if it makes sense to look at different things and put them together and model them and put them out there. So I think that what we're going to see as outcomes, more than one, is going to look different than what we've already seen. And like I said, it's a camel, right? When you have
Jackie, I took a look at the environmental assessment, and I must say I'm not the most skilled reader of these documents because they do tend to be technical, and that
Long. This one is long.
At peak rush hours, I mean, you have something like 40,000 cars an hour, each hour coming into Manhattan. There's big disputes as to how many of those are discretionary, because presumably it's only discretionary drivers who would not be coming in. Who would people who might otherwise be diverted back to the subway. Do the uncertainties raise questions within the advocacy community? Is this a revenue plan? Is this an environmental plan?
It's both. I mean, it's absolutely both, and I don't think we would shy away from saying that it is in equal parts a revenue plan, and that is very important, right? And I think it's important to look back on the context of the system as a whole when this legislation was enacted into law in 2019. As Lisa mentioned, the Summer of Hell that took place in 2017, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with a very old, sort of outdated subway system. We have, as I mentioned, the slowest buses in America, the slowest of which are in Manhattan. And so the MTA needs the revenue, and they need sustained, year after year, not just big chunks of money at once, but they need a revenue source that is sustained, something that, for example, New Jersey does not have. And so I think it's funny to see New Jersey kind of come after New York for implementing congestion pricing and tackling, improving its transit system and reducing congestion. It really should be looking to do the same with Jersey Transit. But I think ultimately we're faced with the climate emergency. We have unprecedented amount of congestion and traffic on our roads every single day. We have more cars now on the roads than we did prior to the start of the pandemic. We need to get emissions and traffic under control. We are seeing sort of the highest death rate on our streets since the implementation of Vision Zero in 2013. I mean, there are many, many problems here, frankly, that cars are causing on our streets. I don't even think Robert Moses himself anticipated the number of cars that we're experiencing on our roads citywide. So these are all problems that congestion pricing seeks to work to mitigate. Again, it's not a silver bullet, right? We're not going to enact congestion pricing tomorrow and then our streets are clear of traffic and everything is wonderful and our subways are running perfectly. But it's one really essential tool, in part because of that revenue that we have in our toolkit to improve our transit system and reduce emissions overall.
A lot of the politics, where the rubber meets the road, that can derail the plan. I mean, how many cheap throwaway metaphors do
I'm admiring
do you want me to try? Have to do with exemptions. And, every exemption you give raises the price everybody else has to pay in order to reach that $1 billion a year nut. I don't know if you have any insight into what the Mobility Committee, the Mobility Commission is considering. I mean, the politics of this is very difficult.
Yeah, that's all still very much TBD, to be
Right.
determined, because it's got to clear this environmental process. that then go to the Traffic Mobility Review Board, which is a 6-member board whose members have been appointed by the governor, as well as, I believe, one by Mayor Adams. And these are the folks who are going to ultimately determine which of these 7 scenarios, or however many there ultimately end up being, take shape, how it will take shape, and who catches the brakes. And on the day it was released, one of the things that jumped out at me was about the taxis.
Especially taxis.
Yeah, there was a lot in there about taxis. Of course, that's an industry that has been battered for some years.
By the Ubers and the Lyft and the for-hire sectors.
Right. So, and it has shrunk, that industry, during the pandemic. A lot of vehicles were taken off the road. And consider that the taxis, the yellow medallion taxis, have already been paying since 2009. There was a fee, a congestion fee, and then there was another one that I believe it was 2019 that it came on. So were they paying 18 or yes, in 2018 another congestion fee that came on. So the taxis have already been contributing.
You're paying that through the meter, though.
Every ride.
Right,
so when you jump on board, there's a 50-cent tax. There is, I believe it's the 250 or 275 tax as well.
50 for yellow and 275
275 for the for hires. So the people who represent and drive and own the medallions say, we want off. You know, like we're getting hit. We've been clipped hard enough. But again,
with reason.
With reason, it's a shrinking industry that has taken a big hit. The financial problems and the financial fallout for the medallion yellow taxi industry, that's been well documented in publications like my own and elsewhere. So, but it goes well beyond that. It goes well beyond the yellow taxis. Everybody wants their exemption. Am I a police officer? Am I a judge who's got to go to court?
Somebody with a disability license plate.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of advocacy on all sides, or if not advocacy, certainly noise for people who just want to catch that break. But I think that the takeaway has to be, and I believe it certainly is from the MTA's perspective, that the more exemptions you have, that cuts into the revenue that the MTA needs for these essential capital projects, and it takes that much longer to get to that goal. And Jackie pointed out we're in a climate emergency, trying to get vehicles off the road. So the goal is to try and accelerate this, not to use
I'm also been struck by, the impact on truck deliveries, where we do get, our everything that comes into this city comes in via truck. It doesn't come in via rail. We don't have a rail freight system. We're very dependent on trucks. And, there have been moves to try to force trucks to deliver outside, outside the 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. period, deliver in the overnight hours. We're trying to make this very crowded, very chaotic city more ordered.
Well, there are issues with overnight deliveries in that Manhattan is becoming more residential.
Yes.
A lot of the buildings don't use the loading docks that they have. That's an issue of city enforcement. No matter what time of day they do it, that also contributes to daytime congestion. But one of the biggest impacts in the environmental assessment was the truck impact on the Cross Bronx, that in any of these 7 scenarios, the number of trucks would go up by 170 to 700 trucks a day, and in one of them have an adverse environmental impact. Now, you can say there's 2 arguments you can make. One is the same argument with the 14-hour peak hour and the no time that you can come in for free, is that, okay, the MTA has laid out these 7 scenarios, but don't worry about them because we will just pick an entirely different scenario that is out of the scope of these 7 scenarios that they've presented. So we're kind of in this strange situation of, if you actually discuss what they put out, you are told, well, we will put something else out later, but we don't know what that is. And that is also true with the Cross Bronx truck situation, that the advocates are saying, don't worry, we will figure out a way to mitigate that. That should be mitigated, and I agree with Jackie, but it should be mitigated in the plan. This can't be something like the ball fields with Yankee Stadium, where you got your new Yankee Stadium, but the ball fields for the kids are delayed and delayed and delayed. And something like capping the Cross Bronx, a multi-billion dollar project, electrification far in the future, the danger is we do this, we have more trucks on the Cross Bronx, and all the mitigation stuff is pushed off to the future. The other argument is that the MTA's modeling is entirely wrong. That's the argument that Charles Komanoff puts out. Perhaps the MTA's modeling is wrong. Of
Well,
course,
just so we know, Charles Komanoff wrote in the Gotham Gazette a story in which I really wish I had revisited my graduate statistics courses. But as I could understand it, is that this plan is going to drive down vehicle usage so much that on a regional basis we will have better air quality. And this part I don't understand. Somehow the cleaner air quality in the Central Business District will help lower the air quality issues on the Cross Bronx Expressway. That's the part that I don't quite figure out. Is that a fair reading of what he wrote?
I think it's a fair reading, but in any case, without getting into the deep details, if the MTA's model is wrong on both the air quality and the traffic impact on the Cross Bronx, the MTA hired the nation's best consultants and spent a year and a half on this. They have 7 different permutations of the model. If they've modeled it wrong, by all means, model it again. But to go forward with a model that the advocates say, don't worry about this, this is wrong. This is the environmental process. This is the legal document that the federal government mandates that we look at to consider the environmental impact. So if the environmental document is wrong, I'm not sure, frankly, what we're doing here. We have to wait for a new environmental document and see what the impact is of the congestion pricing plan.
One of the, some of the work that Tri-State Transportation does is precisely on this inequities and impacts of the entire transportation system, but particularly in cars. And the Cross Bronx issue, which was most forcibly raised, I guess, by Congressman Torres, he's the one who really kind of put it right out there. I think also in the Daily News. I think he may have done it in an op-ed in the Daily News.
And he represents the South Bronx.
And he represents the South Bronx, and it's a very compelling argument. And I know you all are sensitive to that argument.
Yeah, and I agree with Nicole on the sense that the mitigation in the South Bronx and across the Cross Bronx Expressway needs to happen. It can't be punted to post.
But isn't it being punted in this plan?
Well,
I mean, it's not realistic to think that you're going to cap the Cross Bronx before you're going to put the congestion pricing.
No, but again, capping the Cross Bronx isn't the only solution here, right? There are already efforts put in place by the MTA, for example, to electrify the bus depots in the Bronx. So we're going to see a rollout of electric buses.
Which is key for the asthma alley aspect.
Exactly.
Right, the bus garage.
Exactly. And the state has passed the Advanced Clean Truck Rule that will start to electrify medium and heavy duty vehicles. Today, the governor announced a plan to end sales of new internal combustion engine cars, new gas-powered cars by 2035.
On the California plan, in essence.
Based on the California plan, exactly. So capping the Cross Bronx is something that we want to see. You're right, it's not gonna happen tomorrow. It will be a lengthy process, but there are other mitigation tools that the state has in addition to capping the Cross Bronx, which we hope the governor comes out with a statement supporting. She's already indicated her support for such a plan in her State of the State address earlier this year. So it is something that we would like to see coming from her, but there are plenty of things already in motion and that could be expanded on, like electrification. We'd also love to see, you talked a bit about how dependent we are on trucks and not on these other modes. We'd like to see some mode shifting happening from trucks to the water, to rail. Maritime transport would be great, and we think that needs to happen.
Ernesto, And Mr. Malave Jr., who runs the internship program, has a question from a student.
Today's first question from a CUNY student intern is Brianna Leaches, and she attends Queens College. Opposing arguments question exactly how congestion pricing will improve the public transportation system. Can you elaborate further on how congestion pricing might improve public transportation for New Yorkers?
Happy to do that.
Please.
This is the biggest capital plan that the MTA's ever had. It's more than $50 billion. To put that in perspective, previous plans I don't think had even hit $40 billion. So it's very ambitious, and what it aims to do, to put it in the most basic terms for what people feel and see every day, is to hopefully improve the commute. So you would be talking about hundreds of new subway cars. You would be looking at
Signaling could reduce, the time between those
That's
trains.
right. You would the plan when it was first released in 2019 called for upgraded signals on stretches of 6 different subway lines, including the problematic Lexington Avenue line, which, as MTA officials like to remind us, constantly carries more people than if you put together, what is it that they say, Boston, D.C.,
LA.
all these other systems. That's
Combined.
how big
Right.
the Lex is.
Also, new signals for a giant stretch of Long Island Railroad and in Metro North territory.
Lest we forget the commuter railroads, a lot of important
Well,
things
we're
to
city
do.
chauvinists. We do forget that. But that's okay. You can't.
New rolling
I can't
stock along the railroads, new buses, things to speed the commute. Jackie, I think it was mentioned that these are the slowest buses in the country. And when she was talking about that, I thought back, Bob, to our days at the Daily News about 20 years ago. I raced an intern along 34th Street.
Yes.
I walked, the intern took the bus until from the Javits Center to First Avenue, I was in the lead all the way. He beat me at the finish line. So the goal of that very old and weird
The
story
tortoise and the hare.
is to speed, to improve service, to make
We did that
life.
on Newsday from, I think, Jackson Heights to downtown by bike, subway,
Yeah.
car. So
The goal is
Right.
to make things better, and that's really what this capital plan is about, and that's really what funding it is about, finding a sustainable, a steady stream of money. And those are the ways that we as New Yorkers are going to see and feel this thing. As drivers, you'll see it. The hope is in less congestion on the roads, as
But-
commuters, and better service.
But will it be less? I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I wanted to piggyback on to what Jose is saying, because it can't just be, and I'm not saying just, it can't only be about all of this incredible investment on the capital side and investing in new cars and new subway cars and buses and train cars. It has to be investing in better service and more reliability too. It has to be looking at how do we help people who can't afford to get on trains and buses get onto trains and buses? How do we look at the fare structure? How do we look at the best ways to provide equitable service to everybody who, maybe for decades has watched as commuter trains go right by them, but they can't get on because it's $9.75. So instead, they are spending 2 hours and $2.75 to get to work, instead of being able to spend $5 to get on a commuter rail
it's
at
also-
better fare policy.
But, because this stuff is so complicated, a major issue has arisen about people who live either in the zone, do they, driving in and out, or for the fact that the perception is a lot of motorists will come in and park north of the zone and then take the subway down. People north of 60th Street, are you ever going to be able to park on the street? Now, there were people in the city who, called, I must say I have not had a car in a year, so this doesn't impact my life, but, who call parking free car storage, and that may be fine for them. But for people who live in that area,
I live in
and-
Long Island City. This is my language. And
Yes.
you live in the zone, right? You live
I'm
right
just over
there,
the
and you're
line.
just over the line, Jackie. You're not far
I'm in Queens.
away,
I'm-
right?
yeah.
But I watched the car build up. I live right on top of the Midtown Tunnel, so I've been watching the increase in cars. You can't park in my neighborhood now. There's just no way. Everybody comes there now. There should be an increase in parking rides and an attendant increase in service so that people can Go to, I don't know, Metzwald's Point Park there. There's a giant facility that's not used for so many months. This year it'll be used into November.
And the fact of the matter is not that many people, I mean, many people are driving into Manhattan and into the Central Business District, but the majority of commuters, regular commuters
Very
into
important.
the Central Business District are
The
taking
vast,
transit.
the
Not
vast
vast,
majority.
90%.
Yeah, 90%. Tri-State Transportation
right.
Campaign did analysis back in 2018, I believe, where we looked at all different Senate and Assembly districts and found that no one district, I believe, was more than 10% of its commuters
Right.
went in by car.
You know, one of my favorite things when I covered Brooklyn, and one of the earliest versions, it's kind of comparable to using tolling. I must say, I've always been suspicious of using cost as a means of social control. That's just my own personal politics. But there were proposals to toll the East River bridges. You've got the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Williamsburg Bridge in particular, and the 59th Street Bridge, and Howie Golden was the borough president at the time, came up with a brilliant solution. He said, I'll consider it if you put the toll booths on the Manhattan side. Don't give me the backed up traffic. And that's a time before Easy Pass. That's when you were going to have toll booths. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, somebody's ox is getting gored here. And the borough disparities, Assemblymember David Weprin has been an opponent of this since he was in the city council. I mean, he's been one of the loudest voices, of that, believing there's an inequity for, for people who live out in Eastern Queens, where he is, who have to drive into the city to do things. Staten Island had the same complaints in the original plan, and Bloomberg proposed offsets, which is why Staten Island people actually supported it, because they were going to be made mostly whole by having, if they drove into the city, they would get an offset on that fee based, because of the height of the toll in the Verrazano.
I would say that I would remind David Weprin that the majority of people commuting into the Central Business District, even from his district, the vast majority of those commuting in every day are doing so by transit. And I have taken transit out to his district. It's not the easiest thing to do, and the fact that the majority of people are still doing that because driving into Manhattan is so untenable.
Such a nightmare.
It's a complete nightmare, right? I would also remind folks in Staten Island that there is a free subsidized ferry that connects Staten Island to Manhattan. I also think that, we talk about the toll like it's a stick, right? But you have to remember the carrot here, which is the improved transportation, right? That's what's going to help reduce congestion. That's what's going to, it's not just the congestion charging alone that's going to bring about all these benefits. It is the improved transportation that we're going to receive from this.
I want to go to Ernesto for a question, but I want to ask one question before I go back to Ernesto is, what if we don't meet the $1 billion, if it works perfectly and nobody drives in, you're not going to get any money. So, But
then it's not working perfectly, right? That's
Right.
that's not the design of this. Is that and that's why we fear things like exemptions, because we don't legislatively. This has to raise a certain amount of money. And so with every exemption, the toll gets higher and higher. So what we need New Yorkers to do is, share the burden of this a little bit for a better city overall, right?
And a better region and for a better economy.
Yeah, exactly. There's a million reasons why we support this as advocates and
New Yorkers.
And New Yorkers, right? Because we care about the success of our city and the vibrancy of our city and our subway system and our bus system. And so to increase the number of exemptions will only increase the toll that those that aren't exempt have to pay.
There was one scenario B, that as I was looking through all of the different ones when the EA came out, I said, "This is perfect. I mean, this really hits everybody's, everybody and everything that everybody wanted. This one's awesome." And it was pointed out to me that was the only one that didn't raise $1 billion. So they put it in there to show that if you give everybody what they want, it doesn't meet the goal of the legislation. So,
Ernesto.
I realize some of this has been spoken about in pieces, but Teresa Cherry of Queens College asked, beyond congestion pricing, what are the different ways to combat traffic congestion?
Not only to combat traffic congestion, but are there other transportation-related actions that could mitigate some of the environmental problems caused by such massive combustion, internal combustion engines?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that, both the reducing congestion and reducing pollution, because New York has been very successful at that. We went through 2 entire economic booms before the pandemic, going back close to 2 decades, and the number of vehicles entering core Manhattan did not increase. Now, you could say then, why did traffic levels reach crisis points where vehicles within Manhattan were moving less than 5 miles an hour? That was because of Uber and Lyft. We added more than 100,000.
Which goes to the London question.
Right.
Which goes to the London
And
question.
this is still entirely unanswered. We've put out 7 scenarios, but the MTA has chosen to punt the issue, and it's not really the MTA, it's the state legislature and the governor chosen to push the issue of what happens to taxis and FHVs off to
For hire vehicles.
a panel that is going to be under tremendous pressure and not clear from what directions in this case. But if you don't get the Uber, Lyft, and taxis right, these vehicles have a major incentive to stay within core Manhattan, because if you leave, then you might be paying another $23 to come back in. So you could see a scenario where I go from Wall Street to 50th Street and not pay a congestion charge. And so these cars just circulate and fill up in Manhattan, which is basically what was already happening before the pandemic. So that is a big unanswered question. Very, very hard to support this before you know at least some semblance of what the answer to that question is. But other things we can do to reduce congestion and pollution, the pedestrian plazas that Bloomberg began, de Blasio, to his credit, continued, the bike lanes that we built out. The vehicles get more fuel efficient every year, and that will also be true, obviously, on a much larger basis of electric vehicles. So that is the Paris way. Take more and more physical space away from motor vehicles. The London way is actually take physical space away from them and also price the vehicles.
And there has to be some level of personal responsibility as well. I live on the Upper West Side between the Central Park West line, the 7th Avenue line, and I marvel at how many people in a transit-rich neighborhood do the parking tango every morning. Looking around for spaces, and I shake my head at that. So there's that. And when I say personal responsibility, I'm referring also to a fellow who I put in the lead of a story in the city a few weeks ago about the impact that this could have potentially on parking garages south of 60th Street.
Yes, it was
where
very
they
interesting.
could go,
That's parking garages just south of 60th.
Just south of 60th, they'll see
Right.
a decline in business, and the young
While
man,
the parking garages just north of 60th Street would have a boondoggle.
they could, they
Right.
could. Prices could go up if they're already
remember that
if
story.
there's space. But this young man, he was driving.
Why you should read The City, that NYC.
Yeah.
He's driving a Porsche, and he pulls up to this garage on 59th Street. I say, I gotta talk to this guy. And sure enough, we talk. I tell him the story I'm doing. You coming from New Jersey, how is this going to affect you? Well, I might take the bus.
Right.
A guy in a Porsche jumping on a bus to
Yeah.
Port Authority. I know that one resonated with some of the folks at the MTA. Ultimately, that's an
But there
ideal
were
goal.
people talking about this. People coming in on the George Washington Bridge and parking, in Washington Heights. God knows where you find a spot in Washington Heights, which is a different issue. But, it's not just north of 60th Street. It's this idea of people, but even there,
Find
you're
it where they
changing
can.
you're changing people's commuting habits.
Well, we have to give them better options too,
Right.
especially in subway desert areas. We have to improve first mile, last mile options. The MTA is doing some work in some of the suburban communities in Long Island Railroad, Metro North Territory with a toolkit and outreach. But I don't know that the MTA should be the only ones who are doing that. There's hundreds of communities that could be working on that together and collaborating within the counties to help get people to and from the railroads or to the buses, and to have better linkages
Yeah.
between their transit systems to the MTA system, so that you're not then standing there going, well, there's no more taxis anymore.
People want a one-seat ride. They don't want to drive in, schlep themselves in, figure out parking wherever and then get onto transit. They would much rather get on board where they need to go and ride the full
Well, I
way.
remember I think it was Mayor de Blasio's inaugural address, where one of his proposals was to extend the number 4 train down Utica Avenue. I mean, one of the vast transit deserts.
Right.
Besides Eastern Queens,
Sure.
which is a large transit desert for much of it, once you get beyond, around the F and the 7. But he wanted it extended right down Utica Avenue to that whole East
Yeah.
Flatbush, down that whole area that really has no trains.
But a
Senator
lot of
Schumer
what
wants to do that too.
I mean, there's always going to be talk about extending the subway, right? And we welcome those conversations, but I think there is existing rail. It's something that Lisa and PCAC work very, I would call you a ferocious advocate for Freedom Ticket, right? There are these
What is the Freedom Ticket?
So Freedom Ticket is a discount commuter rail. It exists now on the Atlantic branch. It's 10 Southeast Queens stations. For $5, you can get on the commuter rail at any time, as opposed to City Ticket, which is just off-peak, with the option of getting a weekly ticket that includes transfers to subways and buses for $60.
Okay.
So that's a huge discount and a huge time saver, and you get so much of your life back, and we think that it should be available in all of the commuter
I'm
rail
sorry, go ahead.
stations at all times.
No, and I think that is a big way to bridge that gap, right? Especially in parts of the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn, where people may live near a commuter rail station, but it's way too expensive. They don't want to pay $10 to come into Manhattan. Now, with this policy in place, they would be able to do so at a much more affordable rate, and I think that it would incentivize folks to make those trips, where they might be making them in a car because the cost is around the same to shifting onto transit.
It's the next door neighbor for a lot of those residents in those neighborhoods that they just don't know, that they never see. It's a train passing by and it's underutilized. And the PCAC has supported this for a long time. It's existing infrastructure that could be used, but to date hasn't quite gotten.
There are places in the city. You look at Co-op City. Co-op City is the largest, I believe it's the largest residential development,
think so, too.
I think
certainly
it's
in the
the 12th
city.
largest city in the United States.
in,
or it used
in-
to
in-
be something
in
like
the
that.
United States, they don't have subways.
Yeah.
But they will
they have
have
to
a
take
train
buses,
service.
but they have. Go ahead.
And
But
they will have commuter rail service, and this.
but they don't now.
No, but it's being built, and some of the congestion pricing money will go
That's
to
all part
help
of the plan, the
Right.
pay
capital
for that.
They
Penn
would have
access
Metro North, which would take them into, take them into Penn Station. and
into
maybe
Penn Station,
Right.
Penn access, right? But we think that they
But
should be
that's
able
an
to
amazing
pay a
subway
discounted.
desert.
Yeah. Or I used to live in
You
Eastern Queens, actually, when I worked at Queens College, and I lived walking distance.
I went to Brooklyn College,
Oh,
and I'm
well,
not
I
going to
won't
hold
hold
that
it against
against
you.
you.
My grandma went to Brooklyn College, so we're
I
CUNY
worked
and
at
SUNY
Brooklyn
Albany.
College, so-
Yeah, I went to SUNY Albany, so don't hold it against me. But when I worked at Queens College, I lived in Whitestone. I lived near the Auburndale LIRR station. I could walk there. It would have been much easier for me to hop on board there than get to the 7 train, which was much farther away. Although that's often what I did because it was just far too expensive for me to hop on the LIRR whenever I needed to commute into Manhattan.
Where are we going? Is there an end game? Do you see an end game?
Yeah,
We have about 3 minutes left.
Yeah, all these projects are great. I would be remiss not to mention the MTA's cost structure, that there's a risk that people are taken for a ride, to mix another metaphor, a transit metaphor, that the MTA is looking at massive deficits. $2.6 billion deficits every single year, indefinitely, papered over for the next couple of years by federal rescue money until they get ridership somewhere near normal. Now, of course, if you were missing $3 billion, it's better to have at least $1 billion. But without some kind of reform to the cost structure that is part of this plan, this money is just going to go to the operating budget. That is the realistic end game.
Can
of this.
it? Can it?
Anything can happen when the state legislature.
Well, you can put it in capital and then
The state-
move that other money over.
The state legislature can repurpose this money once this is through, and unless they have some credible idea of how to address at least a portion of this operational budget deficit, that is effectively what's going to happen. Now, I'll be my own opponent and say, what's wrong with that? We don't want a transit strike. Transit workers need a raise. Inflation is high. That is a case that can honestly be made, but that means that this doesn't go toward the capital budget, and that is something that people have to understand.
But it's
risk.
totally sold. I mean, and some degree of intellectual honesty is this whole thing is sold as going to the capital budget.
It's in the legislation, but the fact is that there needs to be a parallel path. Sort of the next direction. The next thing we have to do is find dedicated operating money. The MTA is one of the only agencies that has this much money that comes to it from fare box revenue, and that means that
Right.
it is the one that lost the most during the pandemic.
It
Otherwise,
also
it's
has
just-
close to a dozen existing tax streams, and every single one that has been enacted since the early 80s was sold as this fixes the MTA's problems. We heard this in 2009. They have a $1.6 billion annual payroll tax that comes in. This was supposed to go along with cost reform. The cost reform never
Let me
happened.
just, we have about 40 seconds left, so in 40 seconds, sum up this entire issue. I mean, give me the end game. I mean, are people concerned about this bait and switch? I mean, where are we going to be at the end of this process?
Well, I think we're farther along than in previous generations, in previous debates. If you're talking football, you're in the red zone, but that means you've still got a ways to go before you put it
Jets would
across the goal line. Yes, and yes, there you go. There could still be a fumble. Still a couple years in the future before this is up and running, so still a ways to go, Bob.
Well, I want to thank everybody. This was a very spirited discussion. I don't know that we could cover the whole thing, and we will see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.